Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, May 31st, 2021, and on this episode, it's Memorial Day. So I thought the best way to pay respect to those who have lost their lives is to highlight the founders' view and warnings on war, which was almost totally opposite how politicians and people in power approach it today. And maybe if the founders' approach is finally followed once again, there will be far less people, far less dead to have to honor at some point in the future. So I've got 10 to 15, a good handful of quotes on the dangers of war, standing armies, and war powers under the Constitution from people like John Jay, Thomas Paine, James Madison, and maybe 5, 6, 7 others, leading founders and old revolutionaries. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all the archives. On individual episodes like this one, I'm going to link to all the source documents that I'm citing so you can read them in context and learn more or share them at your own time. You can find all the different platforms. We live stream on some mainstream ones like YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and Facebook and things like that. And we also have archive only on some of the more niche or smaller platforms like Gab TV and Library and Odyssey.com. We're also on BitChute and Brighteon and elsewhere. And then the podcast only, audio only edition over at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Podbean, and the rest. You can also find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way for the Constitution and liberty. Again, the show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I just want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I hope you're having a nice long weekend. I hope you're having some time off, and I really appreciate you being here with me. So let's allow people another moment or so to get notifications to join us for this live stream. But hello to Melody, Skaman, and Brody, and Tyler over on YouTube, Facebook. Jeff Accordion, good to see you, buddy. Justin Morrison, Clay Kent, back to YouTube is Rachel, Southern Gent. There's Senator DT in Indiana, appreciate you. Aaron in Brainerd, Minnesota. There's Adrienne on Facebook. And I appreciate everyone for joining me. I apologize if I missed anybody, but I'll check back for some questions and comments either later in the episode, depending on how long I roll with this, or sometime later today. I get a lot of great ideas for follow-up episodes in the comments and then also through email at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Let's start out with John Jay. John Jay is the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was appointed or nominated by President George Washington, but here's a letter to Governor Morris back in September of 1783. And this is a pretty timeless quote that I don't think we hear too often. And he says, while there are knaves and fools in the world, and that is probably all through history and probably every conceivable future timeline that we can think of, there are always going to be knaves and fools in the world. And of course, the knaves like it when the fools follow their approach. And that's what Jay said in another quote. He says, while there are knaves and fools in the world, there will be wars in it. And that nations should make war against nations is less surprising than their living in uninterrupted peace and harmony. I think that's a really powerful one to kick it off with. John Jay actually followed this type of approach up in Federalist Paper number 4 in early 1788. It may have been late 1787. And we know the founders really understood history. And I've talked about this on a number of episodes. They didn't just come up with this just from their experience with the British, but they looked at the long list of history through nations around the world, and they applied those lessons to what they wanted to set up under the Constitution for the United States. And here he is in Federalist number 4, arguing for ratification of the Constitution. And he says, it is too true, however disgraceful it may be to human nature, that nations in general will make war whenever they have a prospect of getting anything by it. That, I think, is absolutely timeless. Nations in general will make war whenever they have a prospect of getting anything by it. We don't think of John Jay when we think of war powers too often. We generally think of people like Jefferson, Madison, Paine, and maybe even Patrick Henry and others. John Jay had a pretty strong opinion here as well. He says, nay, absolute monarchs will often make war when their nations are to get nothing by it. So nations in a situation where they don't even have an absolute monarch will still make war when they can gain something. And people with absolute power, and we can look at the people in power today, and they actually have far more power in many ways than an absolute monarch of that time. Nay, absolute monarchs will often make war when their nations are to get nothing by it, but for the purposes and objects merely personal, such as thirst for military glory, revenge for personal affronts, ambition, or private compacts to aggrandize or support their particular families or partisans. And some people might be thinking, well, they're arguing for ratification of the Constitution. Why are they even talking about this? Well, of course, because they understood history, and they understood so early on here, right in the Fourth Federalist Paper, they understood that people with power would try to expand power, and they would often do that in ways such as warfare, that they had to limit that. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Here's Thomas Paine also recognizing history. He says, war is the common harvest of all those who participate in the division and expenditure of public money in all countries. This isn't something, according to Paine, that would happen once in a while, here and there, from place to place, from time to time. No. In all countries. It is the art, Thomas Paine said, of conquering at home. The object of it is an increase of revenue. And as revenue cannot be increased without taxes, a pretense must be made for expenditures. And Paine really did not pull any punches on this. He's basically saying a lot of times they're going to war as a way to get themselves more money, to enrich their friends, their families. It's basically the same thing that John Jay had said a number of years earlier. This is in Rights of Man in 1791. And here again, Paine says, in reviewing the history of the English government, at least looking at this, its wars and its taxes, a bystander not blinded by prejudice, nor warped by interest, would declare, and let me pull this other one, that taxes were not raised to carry on wars. Wars were raised to carry on taxes. And of course, the founders certainly recognized the danger to public liberty, as we'll get to in the next quote, that war would bring. Here's how Madison put it in a paper called Political Observations, April of 1795. He said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. The most to be dreaded. Why? Of all the dangerous things that could happen to public liberty, he was most concerned about war. Why? Because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War, Madison wrote, is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes, Madison wrote, are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. War leads to armies and debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments. This isn't just some random idea. He's taking the position, and no one's really going to challenge Madison on this because they all understood the history as well. When you have large armies and debts and spending and taxes and all the stuff that we have today, these, according to the founders, according to James Madison, are the known instruments for dominating the many by just a small number of people in power. So they use this type of knowledge of history that we're hearing from James Madison, from Thomas Paine, from John Jay, and there are many others who took this position, but I'm trying to keep it a little narrow here. But they use this knowledge when setting up a system. And here's how James Wilson put it. He says, this system, this is in a speech he gave in December of 1787, this system will not hurry us into war. It is calculated to guard against it. Now, whether that's been successful or not is another story, but their goal was to limit war. They were trying to restrict the ability of the country to just go into war, especially on the ideas or the passions or the notions of a single person or just a small handful of people. Wilson goes on. He says, it will not be in the power of a single man or a single body of men to involve us in such distress. for the important power of declaring war. And when you're talking about declaring war under the Constitution, it doesn't just necessarily have to mean, okay, we're going to have a specific document that says we are declaring war. It's basically changing the state of things from peace to war. Now, if someone attacks you, they've already changed that state, and you don't necessarily need a declaration in response. This is a changing of the state from peace to war. This wasn't going to be in the hands of a single person, a president or a group of people around the president. He says this is vested in the legislature at large. This declaration must be made with the concurrence of the House of Representatives. And here's how James Madison put it in a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1798. Again, understanding history. The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates. Again, looking at the history not just of the British, not just in their own experience, but the history of all governments. The way that we actually can prevent some history from repeating is to learn the mistakes of people in our past and around the world. The Constitution supposes, James Madison wrote, what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature. So that, if you unpack that, it says quite a bit. Not only do they know that all through history in all nations around the world, the executive, whoever is the person at the top of the food chain, is very much interested in war, more so than anyone else. And then that executive would be most prone to it. So they spent quite a bit of time looking at this. They spent a lot of time studying it. And with studied care, they vested that power in the legislature, not in the executive branch. Here's George Washington in a letter to William Moultrie in 1793. He repeats the same thing. The Constitution vests the power of declaring war with Congress. Thomas Jefferson, while president, in a letter to Congress in 1805, Congress alone, he wrote, is constitutionally invested with the power of changing our condition from peace to war. And that's a really good quote so we can understand that the notion of declaring war is really just changing the condition from peace to a state of war. James Iredell, who was like the 4th or 5th Supreme Court Justice and Associate Justice, he was appointed also, James Wilson was as well, but he was also appointed by George Washington. So we've got John Jay, James Wilson, James Iredell, all Supreme Court Justices right off the bat. Really smart legal minds. And here's how he put it. This was in July of 1788 in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention. Iredell put it this way: the president has not the power of declaring war by his own authority, nor that of raising fleets and armies. These powers are vested in other hands. The power of declaring war is expressly given to Congress, that is, to the two branches of the legislature. The Senate, composed of the representatives of the state legislatures. I like how he adds this in. We understand the representation question, and I covered a bit of an anti-federalist opposition to this, and I think there was some misunderstanding in who was representing who, maybe, who knows. But the Senate was representing the states, and the House of Representatives were deputed by the people at large. So again, this is not in the hands of a single person because they understood that the executive would be most interested and most prone to war. Now back to James Madison. Here in his Helvidius Letters, number 4 in September of 1793, he put it this way: the executive has no right in any case. And if you're looking at the image on the screen rather than just listening to the audio here, you could see that in our picture of this, we highlight in all caps and bold, in any case. There is no situation where the executive has a right to decide whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. So it's never, ever in the executive's hands. Now, if someone drops a bunch of bombs on the U.S., that is not a declaration of war. That is a response to someone who has already declared war on you. And of course, I've done some episodes covering things like this, talking about the original legal meaning of declare war and things like that. And also like Thomas Jefferson versus the Barbary Pirates. A lot of people think that Jefferson didn't follow this advice. But certainly we learn when we look at the history that the Barbary pirates actually declared war on the United States. So Jefferson's very measured response, even in that situation, he was very measured, and he specifically said he cannot go beyond the line of defense without authorization from Congress. He was actually probably too limited in how he approached it, even though propagandists who support unlimited executive war-making power, totally contrary to what all the founders said, and here James Madison said so forcefully, he was actually far more reserved, and it's a total opposite story that we're told today. Again, James Madison, the executive has no right in any case to decide whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. Now, it wasn't just the war powers that they were concerned with under the Constitution who would actually make that decision. They spent quite a bit of time on that, as we learned from Madison himself, and they actually decided to vest that power or delegate that power to the legislature. But it was also the concern over standing armies, and we understand that they learned this from their own experience, of course, with the British in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War. And here, for example, is the great Revolutionary War hero, James Warren. On the Boston Massacre Day oration of March of 1775, there was an annual oration given by various people, Warren, for example, John Hancock, and others. And here's how he put it: standing armies always endanger the liberty of the subject. Again, it's not just one of these things that it's once in a while or here and there, or maybe just in our experience or what I've lived through, my lived experience, none of that stuff. Warren is telling us that they always do, always endanger the liberty of the subject. And he was far from alone in this. I've got just a handful of quotes to back him up. Here from George Mason. This was in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He put it this way: when once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. And you recognize the language here. Again, it's not just about if we might have a standing army in this country, we may have a trouble with our liberty. He said, no. We understand history. We've looked through history. We see how this plays out. And in any country, this has happened. Anytime there's a standing army, the people will lose their liberty. Samuel Adams put it this way: a standing army is always dangerous to the liberties of the people. That was in a letter in 1776 to James Warren. And here from the Anti-Federalist, Democratic Federalist in October of 1787, again, a student of history, put it this way: the experience of past ages and the result of the inquiries of the best and most celebrated patriots have taught us to dread a standing army above all earthly evils. This is very similar to what James Madison said on the Federalist side of things. Madison was telling us that war is the greatest threat, perhaps, to public liberty. Why? Because they led to armies and debts and taxes. And very similar. Maybe they've got the order a little different here. But on the Anti-Federalist side, here specifically, a standing army is something to dread above all earthly evils. And the founders, in order to help prevent the need for a standing army, they recognized that standing armies would be needed. And Samuel Adams, specifically in his quote there, he's like, look, it's always dangerous, but we recognize that sometimes we may have to use one. So certainly they wanted the people to have a robust right to keep and bear arms. And part of the reason for the right to keep and bear arms, part of the reason for the Second Amendment, part of the reason that the founders wanted people to have military-grade weapons, was to reduce the reliance on a need for a standing professional army, or at least a large one. They could reduce that actual call. So if the people can defend their own homeland, then you don't have to have this professional standing army, which was a great threat to liberty. And the one that I want to wrap it up with here, this is a relatively short episode today, is from Thomas Paine. And here he is in the American Crisis in December of 1776. Things were kind of a struggle at that point in the fight against the British Empire. And he put it this way. He was actually urging people to push on. He says, not all the treasures of the world could have induced me to support an offensive war, for I think it murder. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you learned something. I hope you're having a really nice long weekend. Let me check out in the live chat and see if there's anything interesting that I can reply to here. Of course, if you want to support us and help us spread the word, make sure to smash the like button, leave a review on Apple Podcast or any other podcast platform, subscribe, get notifications, comments in the archives. All that stuff helps trigger the algorithm of the platform and tells that algorithm to show the program to more people. And as I mentioned at the outset, our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Going to take a quick look over in the live chat and see. Southern Gent says, all the shows I watch like this go by so quickly, need a marathon. Sometimes I feel like I'm doing a marathon myself, so I appreciate that. Clay Kent, awesome as usual. Thank you. Thank you to Melody Skaman. Stay well and stay safe. Much love to all. Southern Gent again says, I agree. Even in our history, the military has always turned on the people and their states. I'm not sure. I haven't really looked at that history, but we recognize that people with power will use the tools of power to oppress them. And of course, it's not even just using the military specifically against the people, like for things like indefinite detention or stuff like that. They were concerned, as Madison pointed out, with the debts and the taxes. You can oppress people through. John Taylor of Caroline he was the leading Jeffersonian Republican in the early 1800s, and he specifically talked about how defending a nation through a large military apparatus defeats the purpose, because what you're having to do is you're having to have oppressive taxation. You have to take so much from the people to pay for this that it's actually worse than should someone come in and invade and take over. They couldn't take as much, is what he put it. So defending a nation through oppressive taxation, oppressive debt, oppressive spending defeats the whole purpose. You aren't defending. This is pure militarism. Absolutely. U.S. history is so young, says someone. Jay Armstrong points out that the CIA involves us by starting the wars, conflicts, and military actions. There's all kinds of covert stuff that goes on that we absolutely should be opposing all along. Of course, they're not supposed to get involved in this stuff without a declaration of war, as required by the Constitution. Again, I will take a look at a little bit more in the comments a little bit later today. If you really want to help us spread the word, again, a reminder, make sure to smash that like button, leave a comment, whether it's live or in the archive, and the membership program, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I will get links to all of these original source documents published sometime about an hour or so after I finish this live stream in just a moment. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, my hope, even though I don't think I have the power to change things in the future, is that we each play our part and continually remind people that the largest military empire in the history of the world that the American founders and old revolutionaries fought against, we now live under a much larger one today. And we really, really need to go back to the vision of the founders when it comes to foreign policy and war, and recognize it not as a way to deal with stuff, but something to avoid almost all the time. There's another quote that I didn't include. Basically, when you're faced with war, you really need to run from it as fast as you can. Don't just dive into it. And that's the type of approach that you can have strength without having a global presence, treating everyone as a vassal state, telling everyone that they have to have better institutions to protect liberty when you're talking about a government that restricts our right to keep and bear arms, spies on everyone on the globe, and the like, spends so much money, the largest government in the history of the world. We are not the land of the free, even though sometimes it feels like it. Sometimes I think people will tell me, like, look, you have the ability to communicate and to spew this nonsense about how bad things are. Well, just because, and as John Dickinson, for example, just because a government is not actively violating your rights, just because it has chosen not to for political reasons or for logistic reasons, doesn't mean you are free. What makes a free people, according to the penman of the revolution back in 1767, is a situation where government is so restricted that it really can't restrict your rights. And we're nowhere close to that today. Again, I really appreciate you spending some time with me here on Memorial Day. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.